These armor-clad soldiers are tough. They are skilled knights, a real challenge. You must use all of your power and skill to defeat them. They are the one, the only, Darknut. They are slow-moving yet powerful knights, best known for their defensive capabilities. Typically, the thick armor and sturdy shields of Darknut render them nearly impervious to frontal attacks. But how did these knights change throughout the Zelda franchise? Did they change in terms of gameplay, use, and abilities? Time to take a look at the evolution of the Darknut. It all started with the very first Zelda game in 1986. This game was released for the NES and the Famicom and became a huge hit. In this game, the Darknuts were heavily armored, resembled caped knights, and extremely difficult to defeat. They come in red and blue variants, and are only a danger when Link comes in direct contact with them. The red Darknut moves slowly and deals 1 heart of damage if Link has no rings equipped, and require 4 hits from the wooden sword to be defeated. Now the blue Darknuts were the real challenge, and there was actually quite a power difference between the two variants. The blue one moves much more rapidly, requires twice as many hits to be defeated, and deals twice the damage. Besides this, Darknuts are impervious to frontal attacks, which are blocked by their shields, making it even harder. Now these knights have to be one of the strongest normal enemies in the game, and a lot of fans agree on this. Usually you would fight them in groups, adding to the difficulty. Overall, these were horrible to fight, because they weren't going to make it easy for you. Now besides this, they weren't really complicated enemies. They just walked around and tried to hit you. When it came to their tactics, they were very basic, but the NES and Famicom were probably not powerful enough to make them more complicated. Now after Link's Awakening, we didn't see them for quite a while. They weren't seen in the first 3D Zelda games, which was quite surprising. They were probably replaced by the famous Iron Knuckle, which was quite similar compared to the first 3D Darknuts. But they did return in The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker, the first 3D appearance of the Darknut, and they made a couple of changes. Now the jump from 2D to 3D will almost always completely change an enemy, and the Darknut became even more difficult to defeat. Wielding a thick-bladed sword and wearing strong armor, they are one of the most difficult non-boss enemies in the game. The Darknut also became smarter. If it drops its sword, it can pick up fallen weapons such as Moblin polearms and engage in hand-to-hand combat. So even if you disarm him, he will fight on. They also try to copy Link's great spin attack if they see Link charging it, so they also learn some new tricks. Their martial arts skills are formidable. Unarmored Darknuts attack with a flurry of quick karate chops or a spinning jump kick that sends Link flying. So the jump from 2D to 3D changed 3 things. Number 1. You have to cut away the strings that hold their armor in place in order to defeat them, adding an extra obstacle and making it more difficult to defeat them. Number 2. Their moveset has become more complex and less linear. This also means that they have become 10 times as difficult. Number 3. Smaller groups. They made the Darknut more difficult, and this also meant that the groups had to become smaller. Otherwise it would be too difficult for most players. This time around they are full-on, heavily trained and very skilled warriors, with counterattacks, different tactics, and karate. But luckily enough, you encounter them later in the game. When it comes to their looks, they changed a lot. They resemble a humanoid Doberman Pinscher with a more veiled snout and nose. This is the first game where we see them as fully trained knights. In previous games, they looked like knights, but when it came to fighting, they weren't. The technology at the time just couldn't handle such things. Complicated attacks, dodges, tactics, the technology was just too primitive. Now after The Wind Waker, they made another 2D Zelda game for the Game Boy, and we also saw Darknuts in this game. These Darknuts look very similar to the ones from The Wind Waker, but are a bit basic compared to the 3D ones. They don't have any of those fancy moves like the karate chops. They are more like the other Darknuts from the 2D Zelda games. We also saw a new type of Darknut in both the Minish Cap and The Wind Waker, the Mighty Darknuts. They are captains, and are essentially stronger, more heavily armored versions of the lower ranking Darknuts. They have a different appearance than the original, with shining red or black armor and a long red cape with a black tunic underneath. In the Minish Cap, Mighty Darknuts are called Red Darknuts, and have an extra electrical attack that is capable of sending Link flying. The darknuts are a more difficult enemy to defeat, a test of your skill for later in the game. 2 years later, a new Zelda game was announced with a more mature theme and the art style changed completely. And so a new darknut was introduced, this time as a mini-boss, and in the last level as a normal enemy. They wield broadswords or large maces and are clad in plate armor that must be sliced off, piece by piece, in order to deal any real damage to them. Now their attacks became a bit more basic, but their defense has improved and was much better than in the previous games, even without armor. Besides this, their armor also became better, since you have to slice it off piece by piece, a bit like the Iron Knuckle from Ocarina of Time. In my opinion, this is the best version of the Darknut. It looks a lot like a real knight and is very challenging. The Darknut has to be one of the most difficult normal enemies and mini-bosses in the entire franchise. It has gone through a lot of changes, from a very basic enemy to one of the most complex in the entire game. And so we move on to the next Oh wait, this is the end of the video. sorry. I don't have anything left essentially, I don't know why I started the sentence. But you can click those videos on the screen right now to watch more, or click the subscribe button, then you won't miss a thing. Or you can follow me on Instagram or Twitter, it's on the screen right now, you can just go there and just follow me on Instagram or Twitter.